The rope bridge swayed 6 inches to the left as Marcus Webb gripped the handrail, his boots planted on wooden slats spaced just wide enough apart to see the white water churning 80 feet below. On the far side of the canyon, through the mist rising from the rapids, he could see them gathering the town council, the engineers from Sacramento, the newspaper man with his notebook, all of them coming to see if the bridge everyone called a death trap could survive what was coming downstream. What none of them knew yet was that the flood racing toward them had already wiped out every crossing for 50 miles. Except this one. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if survival stories like this one pull you in, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode involves a decision that saved an entire wagon train from something far worse than water. Marcus Webb had been in the Colorado Territory for 4 years when he watched Catherine Miller drown in the Arkansas River. It happened on April 9, 1851, 3 weeks into the spring melt, when the snowpack in the Rockies turned every creek into a torrent and every river into something that killed without warning. The Miller family had been trying to reach the settlement on the north bank where Catherine's grandmother was dying. They had waited 2 days for the water to drop. It hadn't. Thomas Miller, Catherine's father, had decided they couldn't wait any longer. Marcus had been checking his trap lines 200 yards upstream when he heard the shouting. He ran toward the sound and reached the bank in time to see the raft 6 logs lashed together with rope, the same design a dozen families had used successfully in calmer water tip sideways in the current. Catherine, who was 7 years old, went into the water first. Her mother Anne grabbed for her and missed. Thomas dove in after his daughter. The raft, now unbalanced and caught in the main current, spun once and broke apart. Anne clung to one of the logs, screaming her daughter's name. Marcus didn't think. He ran downstream, ahead of where the current was taking them, and waded in up to his chest at a point where the river bent and slowed slightly. The water was so cold it felt like knives against his skin. He saw Catherine tumble past, arms flailing, her head going under and coming up in irregular intervals. He lunged, caught her dress, pulled her toward him. She wasn't breathing. He dragged her to the bank, turned her over, pressed on her back the way he'd seen a doctor do once in St. Louis. Water came out of her mouth, but she didn't cough. He tried again. Nothing. Her lips were blue, her eyes were open, but seeing nothing. Thomas Miller's body was found 3 miles downstream 2 days later, caught in a tangle of driftwood. Anne Miller survived by clinging to the log until it washed into an eddy where 2 trappers pulled her out. She left the territory a week after they buried her husband and daughter, heading back east to family in Pennsylvania. Marcus attended the funeral. So did most of the settlement, about 60 people who lived in the collection of cabins, tents, and rough structures that they optimistically called Riverbend. The preacher talked about God's will and the dangers of frontier life. People nodded. They had all accepted that the river was dangerous during spring melt. It had always been dangerous. It would always be dangerous. That was simply how things were. But Marcus couldn't accept it. He stood at Catherine Miller's grave and felt something shift inside him that he couldn't name at the time. It wasn't grief exactly, though he felt that too. It was rage directed at something that couldn't be fought with fists or guns. The problem wasn't the river. The problem was that nobody had figured out how to cross it safely when it mattered most. Riverbend sat on the south bank of the Arkansas River at a point where the canyon narrowed and the water ran fast even in late summer. During spring melt, the river became impassable for weeks at a time. People on the north bank were cut off from people on the south bank. Supplies couldn't cross. Mail couldn't cross. If someone got sick or injured on the wrong side of the river, they either waited or died. The settlement had tried to solve this problem 3 times in the 8 years since its founding. All 3 attempts had failed. The first attempt had been a ferry, a flat-bottomed boat large enough to carry 2 horses or a wagon. It worked well in calm water. During high water, the current was too strong to control the ferry with ropes and poles. The ferry had broken loose during the spring melt of 1846 and disappeared downstream. Nobody had the money or materials to build another one. The second attempt had been a timber bridge, constructed in the summer of 1847 at a cost that had nearly bankrupted the settlement. It was a solid structure, built by a carpenter from Ohio who knew what he was doing. It lasted until the ice breakup of 1848, when massive chunks of ice moving downstream struck the support pillars with enough force to knock two of them loose. The bridge collapsed into the river. The third attempt had been more modest, just a cable stretched across the river with a basket that could be pulled back and forth. It worked for moving supplies, though it was slow and couldn't carry people safely. A windstorm in 1849 had snapped the cable. The settlement had given up after that. People forded the river during low water in late summer and fall. During high water, they simply didn't cross. If you were on the wrong side when the melt started, you waited until June. That was the reality everyone had accepted. Marcus spent the weeks after Catherine's funeral studying the river with an intensity that made people uncomfortable. He walked both banks for miles, noting where the current was strongest, where debris accumulated, how high the water rose during peak flow. He noticed that the failed timber bridge had been built at a wide point in the river where the current seemed calmer. But during high water, that wide section funneled into the canyon downstream and created pressure that had overwhelmed the support pillars. He noticed that ice during breakup moved in chunks the size of wagons, with enough force to destroy anything directly in their path. He talked to old-timers who told him about other bridges that had failed. One had been built too low and was overtopped by floodwater. Another had been undermined when the river changed course and eroded the bank. Every story had a different cause, but the pattern was clear. Solid structures that tried to resist the river's force eventually lost. The river was too powerful, too unpredictable, too willing to exploit any weakness. Marcus realized that if he was going to solve this problem, he needed to stop thinking like everyone else. He needed to build something that didn't fight the river at all. Marcus left Riverbend in early June with a pack mule, 2 weeks of supplies, and a destination he hadn't shared with anyone. People assumed he was heading to the high country to check summer trap lines. Instead, he rode southwest toward the Uncompahgre Plateau, where he'd heard a band of Utes maintained seasonal camps. He wasn't looking for trouble, he was looking for answers. The Utes had been crossing rivers in this territory for generations. They hadn't built permanent bridges because they moved with the seasons, but they had methods for crossing water that white settlers rarely paid attention to. Marcus found their camp on the third day, a collection of hide lodges near a creek that fed into the Gunnison River. He approached slowly, hands visible, rifle slung across his back. An older man stepped forward, and Marcus used the handful of Ute words he'd learned from trappers to explain he wanted to learn, not trade or hunt. They were suspicious at first, but Marcus's patience won a degree of tolerance. He spent 4 days watching how they crossed the swollen creek. They used rope woven from plant fibers and rawhide, stretched between trees on opposite banks. The rope sagged in the middle, and they pulled themselves across, hand over hand, bodies dangling above the water. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. More importantly, the rope moved with the current when debris struck it. The flexibility that would have been a weakness in a rigid structure was a strength here. The rope absorbed impact instead of shattering under it. Marcus left the Ute camp with a new understanding, but he knew a single rope wasn't enough for what Riverbend needed. People couldn't cross hand over hand carrying supplies or children. He needed something more sophisticated, and he wasn't sure where to find it until he remembered stories he'd heard from sailors in San Francisco. He rode west for 2 weeks, reaching the coast in early July. San Francisco was chaotic, full of men chasing gold and ships crowding the harbor. Marcus spent his days on the docks, watching sailors work the rigging on clipper ships. He saw how rope under tension could support enormous weight if properly distributed. He observed the way ships' rigging used multiple anchor points to spread force across the entire structure. A single rope might snap under load, but a web of ropes working together could hold a mast carrying tons of canvas in a gale. He bought drinks for a ship's carpenter in a waterfront tavern and asked questions about knots, rope strength, and load distribution. The carpenter sketched designs on the bar top with a piece of charcoal, explaining principles of tension and anchor points. Marcus absorbed everything, filling a small notebook with drawings and measurements. By the time he left San Francisco in late July, he had a design in his mind that seemed impossible. But then again, so had crossing the Arkansas River during spring melt. Marcus returned to Riverbend in early August with 300 feet of hemp rope, 12 iron rings, each weighing 5 pounds, a block and tackle system, and a plan that made people laugh when he explained it. He was going to build a bridge that hung in the air, supported by nothing but rope and tension. The town council listened to his pitch for 10 minutes before the chairman, a former banker named Gerald Hoffman, stopped him. They had no money for another bridge project. The community had lost too much on previous failures. If Marcus wanted to build his rope bridge, he would do it alone and at his own expense. Marcus had expected this. He had spent most of his savings on supplies in San Francisco, but he had enough left to survive the winter if he was careful. He didn't need the town's money, he just needed them to stay out of his way. He selected his location carefully, the narrowest point in the canyon where the river pinched between rock walls. The span was 80 feet across, but the banks were solid granite, not soil that could erode. Most importantly, the canyon walls rose vertically for 20 feet above the high water mark. His bridge would be above even the worst floods. The anchors were everything. If they failed, the entire structure would collapse into the river. Marcus spent 2 weeks preparing the anchor points on both sides. He started by drilling into the granite using a hand drill and iron bits, working for hours each day to create holes 18 inches deep. The drilling was brutal work. His hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again. Each hole took a full day to complete. He needed 4 holes on each side, positioned to distribute the load across multiple points. Into each hole, he set an iron ring. But he didn't simply drive them in and hope they held. He mixed a cement from lime, sand, and water, a formula the ship's carpenter had told him about. He poured the cement into the holes, set the rings deep, and let the mixture cure for 3 days. The result was anchors embedded in stone and cement, capable of holding thousands of pounds of tension. He tested each one by attaching rope and pulling with all his strength, then adding the weight of rocks until he was confident they wouldn't fail. While the cement cured, Marcus prepared his rope. Hemp rope was strong, but it weakened when wet. He spent a week coating every inch of his rope with a mixture of pine tar and beeswax, working the coating into the fibers until the rope was waterproof and protected from rot. The process was tedious and left his hands black with tar, but it would double the rope's lifespan. By early September, his anchors were set and his rope was ready. The real construction could begin, and people were already gathering on the banks to watch what they were certain would be his spectacular failure. The first challenge was getting the main cables across the 80-foot gap. Marcus couldn't throw rope that distance with enough accuracy, and he couldn't walk across empty air to carry it. His solution came from the block and tackle system he'd brought from San Francisco. He anchored one end of a lightweight guide rope to the south bank, then used a bow to shoot an arrow trailing the rope across the canyon. It took 6 attempts before the arrow landed where he needed it on the north bank. He secured that guide rope, then used it to pull his heavier main cables across, one at a time. The bridge would hang from 4 main cables, each as thick as a man's wrist. 2 cables ran along each side of the walking path, forming the primary support structure. Marcus attached each cable to the iron rings embedded in the granite, then used a Spanish windlass, a simple lever system, to tighten them until they sang with tension. The cables sagged in the middle, forming a gentle curve across the gap. That curve was intentional. It distributed weight evenly and gave the structure flexibility to move with wind and impact. Next came the walking surface. Marcus cut planks from pine logs, each plank 3 feet long and 8 inches wide, but he didn't lay them side by side like a traditional bridge deck. Instead, he spaced them 6 inches apart, creating gaps that horrified the onlookers gathering to watch. People could see straight through the deck to the rapids below. Marcus ignored their complaints. The gaps served multiple purposes. They reduced weight significantly, putting less strain on the cables. They allowed wind to pass through rather than pushing against a solid surface. Most importantly, they let debris and water flow through during floods instead of creating resistance. He attached each plank to the main cables using vertical rope supports, creating a web of connections that distributed the load across the entire structure. Each plank hung from 4 points, 2 on each side. If one connection failed, the other 3 would hold. The pattern repeated across the entire 80-foot span, creating redundancy that made the bridge stronger than any single component. The handrails were the final major element. Marcus strung rope along each side at chest height, supported by vertical posts every 8 feet. The handrails weren't just for balance, they were part of the load-bearing structure, connected to the main cables in a way that helped stabilize the entire bridge. When wind pushed against the handrails, the force transferred to the main cables and down to the anchors, rather than destabilizing the walking surface. By late September, the bridge was complete. It swayed visibly in even a light breeze. The gaps between planks made it look fragile and incomplete. People watched it move and declared it a death trap. Gerald Hoffman stood on the south bank and announced publicly that he would never set foot on such a foolish contraption. Others agreed. But Marcus had built what he intended to build. Now he needed to prove it would hold. Marcus tested the bridge on October 1st with no audience except a trapper named Ben Sawyer, who had camped nearby to watch the construction. Marcus walked out to the center of the span, his weight making the bridge dip and sway beneath him. He jumped twice, deliberately stressing the structure. The bridge moved, absorbing the impact, then settled back into its gentle arc. Ben watched from the bank, shaking his head. When Marcus returned, Ben said he was either the bravest or the stupidest man in the territory. Over the next week, Marcus conducted systematic tests. He carried 100-pound sacks of flour across, one at a time, then two at a time. He led his mule across, the animal's hooves clattering on the spaced planks. The mule balked at first, sensing the movement beneath its feet, but Marcus coaxed it forward. The bridge held. He invited anyone who wanted to cross to try it for free. Nobody accepted. The visible sway, the gaps in the deck, the way the whole structure moved in wind, it looked wrong to people accustomed to solid timber construction. In November, the town council authorized construction of a new timber bridge a mile downstream at a wider point in the river where the current seemed less threatening. They hired 2 carpenters from Denver who had experience with bridge building. The project cost the community $800, funded by contributions from merchants and a loan from a bank in Colorado Springs. The timber bridge took 6 weeks to build. It was solid, stable, and reassuringly motionless. When it opened in late December, a celebration was held. Nearly everyone in Riverbend walked across it that first day, marveling at how sturdy it felt compared to Marcus's rope contraption upstream. Marcus didn't attend the celebration. He spent the winter maintaining his bridge and using it daily to check trap lines on both sides of the river. A few others began crossing it regularly, a trapper who lived north of the river, a widow named Sarah Chen who found the rope bridge closer to her cabin than the timber bridge, and surprisingly, a group of children who treated the swaying deck like an adventure. Their parents scolded them and forbade them from using the rope bridge, but the children often ignored the warnings when adults weren't watching. Winter brought ice, and both bridges faced their first serious test. The Arkansas River froze partially, with thick ice forming along the edges and thinner sheets floating in the main current. When the temperature fluctuated, ice chunks broke free and moved downstream. The timber bridge suffered damage when a large piece of ice struck one of the support pillars, cracking it. Repairs were made in January. Marcus's bridge received hits from ice as well, but the flexible rope structure absorbed the impacts. The bridge would swing to one side when struck, then return to center. No damage occurred. By March, the snowpack in the high country was heavier than anyone could remember. Old-timers who had lived in the territory for 20 years said it reminded them of 1846, the year of the Great Flood. The warm winds arrived on April 7, 1852, 3 days earlier than usual, and carrying temperatures that climbed into the 70s by midday. Marcus stood on the bank of the Arkansas River and watched the water rise. It had been running high for a week, fed by normal spring melt, but the sudden warmth accelerated everything. By evening, the river had risen 6 inches. By the next morning, another foot. The sound changed from the usual rumble to a deeper roar that could be heard from a quarter-mile away. People in Riverbend began moving supplies and livestock to higher ground. This was standard practice during spring melt, a precaution taken every year. But Marcus noticed something different this time. The river wasn't just rising steadily, it was rising in surges, as if massive amounts of water were being released upstream in waves. He had seen this pattern once before, 4 years earlier, when an ice dam had formed in the high country and then suddenly broken, sending a wall of water downstream. He mentioned this to Gerald Hoffman, suggesting people should move to the highest ground available and prepare for serious flooding. Hoffman thanked him for the concern but said there was no need to panic the community. By April 9th, the river was 4 feet above normal spring levels. The timber bridge downstream was still above water, but the current flowing beneath it was violent enough that nobody dared to cross. Debris, entire trees, parts of cabins from upstream settlements, the carcass of an elk rushed past the bridge pillars with enough force to shake the structure. Marcus watched from his rope bridge, which hung 20 feet above the current, untouched and motionless except for the wind. Several people had climbed to the south bank to watch the river, and he heard them joking nervously about whether the timber bridge would hold. Nobody was joking about his bridge anymore. They simply weren't thinking about it at all. That night Marcus couldn't sleep. He could hear the river from inside his cabin, a sound like continuous thunder. Around midnight he dressed and walked down to the bank. The moon was nearly full, and he could see the river clearly. It was higher than he'd ever witnessed, now within 2 feet of the timber bridge deck. As he watched, a massive log struck one of the center support pillars. The impact was loud enough to hear over the roar of water. The bridge shuddered but held. At dawn, Marcus was still on the bank. Other people began arriving, drawn by the same instinct that had kept him watching through the night. They stood in small groups, staring at the river that now looked less like water and more like a living thing trying to tear itself free from the canyon. By mid-morning, the timber bridge deck was underwater. By noon, the support pillars were groaning under the pressure of current and debris. By 3 in the afternoon, the center span collapsed. The sound was like a rifle shot, sharp and final, followed by the crash of timber hitting water. The bridge was gone. The flood accelerated after the timber bridge fell. With no structure to slow the debris, massive logs and uprooted trees shot downstream like battering rams, striking the banks and tearing away soil. By evening on April 10th, the water had risen another 3 feet. It was now 8 feet above normal spring levels, the highest anyone had ever recorded. Marcus moved his supplies to the highest shelf in his cabin and prepared for the possibility that he might need to abandon it entirely. The settlement of Riverbend sat on a bench of land that rose gradually from the riverbank. The first row of cabins and structures stood about 15 feet above normal water levels. That had always been considered safe. By nightfall, water was lapping at the foundations of those buildings. People began evacuating to higher ground, carrying what they could and abandoning the rest. Marcus helped where he could, moving families and their belongings to cabins further from the river. Around midnight, the sound changed. Instead of the steady roar that had become almost background noise, there was a deeper rumble that seemed to come from upstream, growing louder. Marcus ran to the bank and saw it in the moonlight, a wave, perhaps 4 feet higher than the already swollen river, moving downstream like a wall. It hit the settlement with the force of something solid. The first row of cabins didn't just flood, they disintegrated. Walls collapsed, roofs lifted and spun away, entire structures broke apart and vanished into the current. People screamed and ran. Marcus grabbed a woman who was frozen in shock and pulled her toward higher ground. The wave passed in less than a minute, but behind it the river maintained its new, higher level. More cabins flooded. A barn collapsed, spilling livestock into the water. A storage building that held the community's reserve supplies was torn from its foundation and swept away. By dawn on April 11th, Riverbend had effectively ceased to exist as a functional settlement. 47 people had made it to high ground on the south bank. Another 36 were trapped on the north bank, cut off when the timber bridge collapsed. Between them was a river too violent to ford, too wide to throw a rope across, and too dangerous to attempt any kind of raft crossing. People on both sides could see each other across the water, but they might as well have been separated by 100 miles. Supplies were running low on both sides. Injured people needed medical attention. Children were separated from parents. Gerald Hoffman stood on the south bank at sunrise, looking at the wreckage of the town he had helped build. Someone mentioned the ferry site 2 miles downstream. Hoffman shook his head. The ferry was gone, swept away in the initial surge. Someone else suggested waiting for the water to drop. Hoffman looked at the river, still rising, and said they didn't have time to wait. Then Ben Sawyer, the trapper who had watched Marcus build his bridge, pointed upstream. Through the morning mist, barely visible against the canyon walls, Marcus's rope bridge still hung across the gap, untouched and waiting. Marcus reached his bridge at first light on April 12th. The rope structure hung exactly where he had left it, swaying gently in the wind that funneled through the canyon. The water below had risen to within 12 feet of the deck, closer than he had anticipated, but still clear. Debris rushed past beneath the bridge logs, pieces of buildings, objects he couldn't identify in the swift current. Nothing had struck the structure. The bridge had simply moved with the wind and waited. Gerald Hoffman arrived an hour later with 15 people from the South Bank. They stood at the canyon edge, looking at the swaying rope bridge with open fear. Hoffman asked Marcus if it would hold. Marcus said, "It had held through winter ice and spring winds. It would hold now." Hoffman looked at the gaps between the planks, at the water visible through the deck, at the way the whole structure moved. He asked how many people Marcus thought could cross safely. Marcus said he had tested it with 800 pounds of weight. A person could cross, maybe 2 at a time if they were careful, but not more than that. The first person to cross was Sarah Chen, the widow who had been using the bridge all winter. She stepped onto the deck without hesitation, gripping the handrails and walking steadily across the 80-foot span. The bridge dipped under her weight and swayed with her movement, but she reached the north bank in less than 2 minutes. People on both sides watched in silence. When Sarah waved from the other side, someone on the south bank let out a breath they didn't know they'd been holding. Marcus organized the crossings carefully, one person at a time, with 5-minute gaps between each crossing to let the bridge settle. He stationed himself at the south end, giving instructions and making sure people understood how to move with the bridge's sway rather than fighting against it. Children went first, then women, then injured men who needed help on the other side. Some people crossed quickly, eyes fixed straight ahead. Others moved slowly, gripping the handrails so tight their knuckles turned white. One man made it halfway across before freezing in panic. Marcus walked out to him, talking quietly until the man could move again. The crossings continued through April 12th and 13th. People from the North Bank crossed south. People from the South Bank crossed north to reunite with family members. Supplies were shuttled across in bundles tied to ropes. A doctor crossed to the north side to treat injuries. By the evening of April 14th, 43 people had crossed Marcus's bridge to safety or reunion. Not one person had fallen, not one plank had broken. The bridge that everyone had called a death trap had become the only thing keeping the community connected. On April 15th, the river finally began to drop. People on both banks started the work of rebuilding what the flood had destroyed. And Gerald Hoffman, standing on solid ground after crossing the rope bridge for the first time, told Marcus that he had been wrong about everything. The Arkansas River returned to normal levels by early May, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Riverbend was gone. Most of the original settlement had been swept away or damaged beyond repair. The survivors relocated their community to higher ground, building on a plateau that rose 40 feet above the river. They called the new settlement New Riverbend, and the first structure they built was a rope suspension bridge connecting the community to the North Bank, designed by Marcus Webb and constructed with contributions from everyone who had crossed his original bridge during the flood. Word of the bridge that survived spread quickly through the Colorado Territory. Miners working remote claims in the high country heard about it. Settlers moving west along newly established trails asked about it. Engineers from Denver and Colorado Springs traveled to see it with their own eyes. They walked across the swaying deck, examined the anchor points embedded in granite, studied how the load distributed across multiple cables. Some took measurements, others made sketches. All of them recognized that Marcus had solved a problem that had killed people and destroyed infrastructure for years. Over the next 3 years, rope suspension bridges began appearing across the frontier. A mining camp in the San Juan Mountains built one across a gorge that had claimed 5 lives in 2 years. A settlement in Wyoming constructed one over the North Platte River using Marcus's spacing pattern for deck planks and his method for waterproofing rope. The U.S. Army hired Marcus in 1854 to consult on the WAIF, a bridge project at Fort Laramie. He spent 2 months teaching soldiers his techniques, refusing payment beyond basic supplies. When officers insisted on compensating him, he asked only that they share what they learned with anyone who needed it. Marcus never patented his design or tried to profit from it. When people asked why, he told them about Catherine Miller. He said innovation born from tragedy didn't belong to one person. It belonged to everyone who might benefit from not dying the same way. Some people understood. Others thought he was a fool for giving away something valuable. Marcus didn't care about their opinions. He cared that fewer people were drowning in rivers that could be crossed safely. The original bridge stood for 23 years. It was finally replaced in 1875, not because it failed, but because the community had grown large enough to need a wider crossing that could handle wagon traffic. The new bridge was built using Marcus's principles: flexible design, multiple anchor points, load distribution across redundant connections. When they dismantled the old rope bridge, several people asked to keep pieces of it. The hemp rope, still waterproofed with pine tar, had held strong for more than 2 decades. Marcus Webb died in 1879 at the age of 56. He had spent his last years training younger builders in suspension bridge techniques. He was buried on the plateau above New River Bend, within sight of where his first bridge had hung. His gravestone made no mention of engineering or innovation. It simply read, "He built what was needed." And across the Rocky Mountain frontier, in canyons and gorges where water ran fast and dangerous, dozens of rope bridges still swayed in the wind, carrying people safely across.